there has never been a pivot to hurt Putin. He wants Putin to get a good deal. He believes Ukraine should lose the war. And he is now simply saying his mind more openly, we might say. But there's been no pivot. There's been no changes. This is Trump. This is what he wants. And he is going to try and bully both Ukraine and Europe to get it.
So the European Union, working with the United Kingdom, are getting really close to finding a way to hand 100 billion euros or so to Ukraine. Government sources here are saying that could be announced in these coming days. But how encouraging is it, or not, to hear President Trump talk about Ukraine's bleak prospects of getting the kind of deal Ukraine says it needs and wants? This is what the president said to Politico, Politico's Dasha Burns, just a short while ago in an interview.
I think they're weak, but I also think that they want to be so politically correct. I think they don't know what to do. Europe doesn't know what to do. They don't know what to do on trade either. I mean, I look at a lot of the trade, situation that's going on over there. It's a little bit dangerous, but Europe, they want to be politically correct, and it makes them weak. That's what makes them weak.
Does that sound like a friend and ally? Does it sound like a president who wants to link arms with Europe in support of Ukraine? Not sure it does. But Ollie Wright is the policy editor at The Times. Hi to you, Ollie.
Hello.
So, I mean, just your thoughts on the interview from President Trump. It's in keeping with the global foreign policy document that we had at the weekend. It's in keeping with what we've heard from others in the administration in the past. He's not very keen on Europe at all, but nor does he seem very keen on joining Europe and putting maximum pressure on Russia.
No, I think that's fair to say. But I mean, you have to remember that, Trump has blown hot and cold on this a lot. He's changed his positions over, whether he thinks that Russia needs to do more or Ukraine needs to do more. And I think in London and other European capitals, what Trump has said today won't come as a great surprise. And they also know that it may not be exactly the same as what he says tomorrow. Their view very much is, look, you've got to keep the Americans on side. You've got to engage with the Americans. You've got to try and be constructive, but you also have to use all the levers you have. And that's not just Trump. That's senior Republicans in Congress. That's talking to Marco Rubio, the Trump's Secretary of State, who's a good deal more hawkish on Russia than perhaps the president is, to try and build a coalition to influence Trump to get the best possible terms for Ukraine. Yeah. And into that comes, what you were talking about a minute ago, which is this whole question of frozen Russian assets.
And with President Trump's support of Ukraine at best uncertain, and his feeling of solidarity with Europe at best highly, highly dubious, the idea of sending Ukraine or finding a way to get 100 billion euros to Ukraine is all the more important.
Yeah, it is. And the reason why it's significant, it's because it's extraordinarily vital that Ukraine gets this money if the war is going to go on. You look at the projections for Ukrainian spending next year and the shortfall in its budgets. It needs about $65 billion just to keep going next year. Yes. Now, with Trump and the US looking increasingly unlikely to provide that kind of funding, and indeed Europe with its own debt problems, if somehow they can leverage this frozen money, they can provide the funding for Ukraine, which it can allow them to legitimately say, look, we're going to carry on. And the point is that's leverage in any peace talks. And indeed, if there is a settlement, some of this money, the idea is, could be used in the reconstruction of Ukraine.
Right, great to hear from you, Oliver Wright. Thank you so much. Now, I want to welcome Igor Novikov, who is a former advisor to Volodymyr Zelensky and on the subject of US relations. Igor, welcome back to the programme.
Hi, John. Thank you.
Tell me, Igor, it's great to have you. Can you give me your assessment of the importance, the value of a payment of £100 billion from the European Union and Britain? Importance in the sense of keeping the war on track. Importance in the sense of just keeping the country going.
Well, John, you have to understand one thing. I mean, regardless whether we're talking about potential ceasefire and post-war economic difficulties Ukraine is facing, or the war effort, somebody needs to pay for it. I mean, it's still a miracle that Ukraine is still alive economically after 4 years of the war of attrition against what used to be a superpower. But Ukraine needs that money to keep going. And this war is not only about missiles or drones or anything like that. It's a hybrid war. So it's also a political war, it's an economic war, and it's a terrorist war against, the Western world. So the funding is important, but it's also important to understand the context of this war and that it doesn't end on the front lines or on the battlefield. This war is everywhere.
Yeah, it is hard, Igor, to be at all optimistic, isn't it, about what will happen in Washington when the European leaders and the redrafted peace proposals put together with President Zelensky this week, when that gets to Washington. It's hard to believe that's going to be allowed to make very much progress.
Well, remains to be seen, because President Trump does pivot quite a lot on his worldviews and how he sees the process, and sometimes he gets bored of it and promises to give up and just refocus on something else. So that remains to be seen. But once again, what's important here is to realize that this is not only Ukraine-Russia war, it's a hybrid war against Europe, and we're seeing it now.
Yes.
I'll give you one example. One project that I'm, for example, focused on and working on right now is protecting potentially our civilian aviation post-war. And if you look at, the current threats facing not only Ukraine, but European airports, for example, I mean, none of them are protected from FPVs. And Russia is not shying away from kind of testing the waters for a major disruption. So I think, the effort needs to be streamlined, and we need to prepare for what's to come, regardless of what Trump does.
And Igor, talking about infrastructure and talking about daily life, tell me what this money would mean day to day for normal life in Kyiv. Clearly, I recognize it'll be needed to help rebuild and keep energy infrastructure going. But what about schools? What about hospitals? What would it do there for the people of Kyiv and of Ukraine?
Well, John, you have to realize, and obviously it's easier for me to kind of see from here, as we speak right now, I'm on the power generator. So 70% of Kyiv, that's a city of more than 2 million people, is in a blackout right now. So running an economy, the energy sector of the economy during peacetime is difficult nowadays because of inflation and, global debt and everything. Now, just imagine running that when what used to be a superpower attacks it with drones and ballistic missiles on a weekly basis. So basically, that money is needed to make sure that at least we have some power, because what Putin wants is a multi-day or week blackout in Ukraine or in Kiev, which will make Kiev unlivable. People will start leaving. There will be chaos. And, I don't think Kiev falls, but it substantially weakens Ukraine. And if we keep on that trajectory, hypothetical trajectory, if Ukraine falls, do you really think Russia stops? Do you really think Putin is afraid of Article 5 after what Trump says of the NATO?
All right, great to get your thoughts as always, Igor Novikov there, former advisor to Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, we can get the thoughts and the thinking of Professor Phillips O'Brien now, who's a professor of strategic studies at St Andrews University and the author of War and Power, Who Wins Wars and Why. Professor, hello, welcome back to the programme.
Thanks for having me, John.
Do tell me, and you're very welcome, just give me your reflections on what the most recent contribution we've heard from President Trump in that Politico interview, just denigrating European leaders as weak as well as politically incorrect, and giving it as his view that European leaders should recognise the realities in Ukraine, where he argues Russia has the upper hand and it's time for Ukraine and the European friends of Ukraine to give ground to Putin.
The only surprise of this is that people are surprised. This is what he believes. It is what he has said and how he has acted for the entire time of his presidency when he wasn't throwing out chaff. I mean, this is pure Trump, and this is what he has been trying to do. There has never been a pivot to back Ukraine. There has never been a pivot to hurt Putin. He wants Putin to get a good deal. He believes Ukraine should lose the war, and he is now simply saying his mind more openly, we might say. But there's been no pivot. There's been no changes. This is Trump. This is what he wants, and he is going to try and bully both Ukraine and Europe to get it.
So part of his reasoning, part of the president's reasoning, is that Russia, obviously, he argues, has the upper hand in this war. Does Russia have the upper hand in this war?
Well, it depends. The front line isn't moving much. When it does move, the Russians on the whole are making advances. However, the Russian economy is suffering a great deal. The Ukrainian economy is also suffering a great deal. By most definitions of war, we're pretty close to a stalemate. The both sides are absolutely suffering. The thing is that Trump has done his best to help Putin. So when he talks about Russia winning, what he's not saying is he's cut off all aid to Ukraine. So Ukraine has had to fight this year with no U.S. aid from the Trump administration. They've only sold a small number of weapons, whereas the Russians are receiving a great deal of support from countries like China, from Iran, from North Korea. So we are in a stalemate, and Russia is receiving a great deal of aid. And if Ukraine were going to be aided the way that it had been under the Biden administration, say, which provided it $130 billion of aid, the war would probably be much more in Ukraine's favor. So Trump is, in many ways, creating the conditions to make his argument. But it's also what he wants to be the case. He wants Russia to do well. He wants Putin to be victorious. So his portrayal of the war is based on his desires as much on any strategic reality.
Okay, look, one of the Putin and Kremlin demands is to, as it will be given as part of a deal, unconquered parts of the Donbass. Sure. Now, that would include some of those cities and towns known as fortress cities, strategically important. Now, quite apart from the question of principle or the political, maybe insurmountable obstacles to Zelensky agreeing to any such condition, what would be the strategic importance of not handing over that territory and those cities?
Well, I mean, this territory is vital for Ukraine, but all of Ukraine is vital for Ukraine. I mean, handing over to Russia legally, which is what Trump is talking about, is a catastrophe for Europe. Handing over the unconquered territory is just giving a gift to an aggressor. It's basically saying to Putin, you can't take this territory, even though you've lost over 1 million soldiers, but still we're going to find a way to get it to you. And for Ukraine, that would be devastating. It would be devastating to lose the fortress line, but it would also be devastating politically. It means that you can be set up for failure in the future and give up more territory. So it just seems to me from the Ukrainian point of view, that has to be a non-starter. And it should be a non-starter for all of Europe. I mean, if European states are actually forcing Ukraine to hand over some territory to Russia that the Russians haven't seized, they are opening up a can of worms, and I don't think there will be any coming back for it for post-1945 Europe.
Okay, remarkable stuff. And what is your judgment, finally, on the strategic importance of President Trump saying in this latest interview that leaders of Europe are weak, that they're leading decaying countries, just a withdrawal of faith and trust and any spirit of partnership from former allies? What does that mean for the global strategic balance of power?
Well, again, it should have meant nothing because they should have realized this months ago. I mean, the frustrating thing is this was not a surprise. This is what he has believed. In fact, if you read that interview, if you read the whole interview, you'll see he mocks the Europeans for calling him daddy. He actually goes and makes fun of them. So this whole European attempt to suck up to Trump has just been a catastrophe. It's gained them nothing. It's wasted a huge amount of time, and it's fed his own prejudices. So him saying it now, as I said, is a good thing. This is good. Get it out in the open. Europeans can't deny it. They have to decide whether they are okay being this sort of flunky to the United States, or whether European states want to start looking after their own security with their own resources.
Okay, but clearly, Professor, they're thinking of someone like Keir Starmer, and it's maybe even clearer in the case of someone like Mark Rutte at NATO, that it's better to try to be on the president's good side than to simply throw your hands in there and give up on that effort, because there's more harm to be to encounter that way.
No, I think that's a failure of policy. And it's based on the assumption that Trump somehow can be won over. The best way to deal with Trump is the way the Canadians have dealt with Trump, by being very clear and standing up for their own rights. The Europeans have gotten nothing from this. It's actually been slightly pathetic. It's probably weakened them. It's wasted a great deal of European time, and it's based on a false premise. So I would say the British premise, which I've heard spoken about in meetings, is the United States is going to come back. We're going to go back to being great friends, and the future will go back to where it was. It's not going back. It's a way of denying the reality in which Britain finds itself. Britain has to realize the United States, there is no special relationship. There's no Anglo-American partnership on which Britain can base its future. It has to work out a good relationship with European states if Britain is going to be secure, and it has to give up this dream of a non-existent America that no longer is here.
Okay, interesting. Say, Professor Phillips O'Brien at St Andrews University, thank you for coming on the program this afternoon.